River.
Here, here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since this is my first time to rise this session, I just want to say how pleased I am to now have the new role as Deputy Whip. It is an honour to continue my work on the behalf of the great people of North Island Powell River in this very place. Mr. Speaker, in December I was meant to be here to do my speech with the amazing member from Abitibi Bay, James Nuvit EU. Sadly, I had to rush home to be with my mother, who had a stroke. I apologize to the member for missing his important speech and thank him for his kindness during a very difficult time for my family and I. As my mother slowly heals, it makes me reflect on how often many of us are here away from our home and hope that we all take time to appreciate the people who love us most. Mr. Speaker, when I was 4, I was adopted after 2 years of my mother and I being part of my father's family. I did not find out I was adopted until I was almost 9. This is important today because this is how I am able to say my family is from Stilatin First Nation and my aunt is my hereditary chief, Hadasak Kua, which means peace within the frame of a house. And I'm very honored to be a part of my family and all the great and courageous work that they do. My granny, Minnie Mould, went to residential school from the time she was 4 until she was 16. The impact on our family has been powerful due to the abuse that she suffered there. She has been gone for many years, but I can promise you, this was not the place she would have ever thought one of her granddaughters would be speaking. There are days when I literally feel her spirit sigh with relief because she told me many times, "No complaining, we are still here." The very reason that we are speaking today on this bill is because Indigenous people are still here after many, many attempts to assimilate them. Today we speak about how important Bill C-262, an act to ensure that the laws of Canada are in harmony with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This bill will provide clarity. Across my riding of North Island Powell River, communities and businesses are asking for clarity. They want to know how to move forward and continuously ask me about this bill and for a secure definition of what nation to nation means. This bill would move Canada in a direction by providing a legislative framework that would begin to harmonize Canadian laws with the UN Declaration. To repeal the Indian Act means we need a new legislative framework. On April 12, 2016, the Minister of Justice stated in the House of Commons, "It is not easy to remove the shackles of 140 years of life under the Indian Act. The Indian Act is not a suitable system of government. It is not consistent with the rights enshrined in our Constitution, the principles as set out in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or the calls of action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report." End quote. As Canada moves towards repealing the Indian Act, we require a new framework. In my riding, Tla'amin recently signed a treaty. It was a difficult process with a very close vote that was hard on the community in many ways. However, there was a very clear celebration where the community burnt the Indian Act because it no longer applies to them. In a supportive movement of reconciliation, the wider community was invited and attended the community. The reality is, reconciliation is happening on the ground in many communities across Canada. I know of many in my riding, and it is well past time that the federal government get onto this pathway by passing this bill. There are concerns, and the biggest one that I have heard is the idea of Indigenous communities having the power of veto. I have to say that Grand Chief Ed John said it best, quote, "The bad thing about the media and those who don't support the Declaration is how could those Indians have a veto?" I think there's a misconstruction of the concept of free, prior, and informed consent. The better interpretation of free, prior, informed consent at the end of the day is a decision that's made after a process. So governments go through a process to come to some decision. First Nations governments are in that same place. First Nations governments will look at information ahead of time. They should be free from any coercion. It should be prior to the decision being made. There should be an extensive consideration. It may require an environmental assessment process or some other process that would help inform the decision-making process. Free, prior, and informed consent essentially at its core is about governments making decisions. When the province of British Columbia, the provinces, the national government, and the territorial governments or municipal governments are making decisions, that is what they are doing, end quote. This bill is not about giving power away power. It is about making sure that everyone is at the table. Currently, in my riding, a very long-term issue has been gaining momentum as several Indigenous communities have begun occupying fish farms. This has been a very divisive issue for many years. I want to be clear. There are some Indigenous communities who are in support of fish farms and some who are not. Within the communities themselves, there are people working for fish farms and some who are occupying them. The concerned Indigenous communities have been asking for a process of consultation. The federal government has not shown up. Just last week, there were discussions between Indigenous communities and the provincial government. The federal government was invited, specifically the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, but did not show up. In fact, 2 DFO staff did show up, but no one from the minister's office. My hope is that this government will take seriously the commitment of Bill C-262 and make sure everyone is at the table so the best decisions can be made. In my riding, the workers in the Indigenous communities are filled with uncertainty, and this is not good for anyone. I hope to see this government respect the rights of Indigenous leaders, to have a voice on what happens in their territory, to be part of the decision-making process. Across my riding, the process of nation-to-nation relationship is in action. A couple of summers ago, I went to Tassis for a flag-raising ceremony. The communities of Gold River, Tassis, and Mawachet-Muchelet signed an MOU on how to work together. The flag raising was to add the Mawachet-Muchelet and Mawachet-Muchelet flag along with the Canadian provincial and town flags. The knowledge that they are all in this together has become a cornerstone of their economic and social decision-making. These are not the only communities who have signed these agreements. Liam and Impel River, Comox and the town of Comox, the village of Alert Bay and Namgis are but a few of the examples across the riding. They know that together they can work for the betterment of all of their people. Like my granny always said, we are in this together. Last summer, I had the honor to participate in a discussion with a high school, the teachers and care people, in my riding on the issues of reconciliation. Many Indigenous teachers, non-Indigenous teachers were asking, how do we help when we are so worried we will cause harm without intending to? Beautifully honest questions from people who really care. What we came to is simply this. We have to be honest about what we know and what we do not know. That a safe place is created for conversation and that the guidance from elders is a must. This is reconciliation in action. Mr. Speaker, a couple of weeks ago, a young Indigenous man of 19 committed suicide successfully in one of our communities. The impact has been painful to say the least, but we know that in too many Indigenous communities across Canada, we are losing our young people. Many of these communities are calling for help. This bill will increase the attention on the realities that too many Indigenous communities face. These are ongoing impacts of colonialism, and with this bill, we would see a legislative framework that would begin to take into account the realities of intergenerational trauma, severe impoverishment, epidemics of suicide, and impairment of mental and physical health, and the profound loss of hope should receive finally the attention that they so richly deserve. We are all in this together, and it is time to face the history of Canada, to let go of blame and shame, and finally focus on working on healing. Our children deserve it, and they can no longer wait. Paulo Freire said, quote, "Any situation in which some individuals prevent others from engaging in the process of inquiry is one of violence. This means the means used are not important. To alienate human beings from their own decision-making process is to change them into objects. For too long, Indigenous communities across this country have been treated like objects that do not deserve the right to engage in the process of decision-making. This bill is a step toward reconciliation, a step in moving from words to action. Mr. Speaker, I must say, there is just so much that Canada and this place can learn from Indigenous communities. In my riding, I have been approached by many people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, asking if we could not work together here to change the culture of this place. Wouldn't it be better if, rather than yelling at one another, we spoke to one another and listened and made decisions that were more balanced? I hope that this bill leads us in that very direction. I believe that reconciliation is also about learning from the First Peoples of this land. Mr. Speaker, there is much to learn. Thank you.